Everybody, Chris Gilmour here. Welcome to the Resilient Future Series, Practical Solutions for Uncertain Times. I'm wondering, folks, could you just message in the chat really quick and let me know if the audio is coming through and if the video is okay? I just want to make sure everyone can hear me and that we're good. Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. It's always nice to have a little check-in to start things off here. So, as I said, tonight is called the Resilient Future Series, Practical Solutions for Uncertain Times. And I think I'm going to just start off by introducing a little bit about what this series is all about and kind of where we're going. We have a guest on with us tonight, Dr. Naeem. He'll be coming on shortly here. But yeah, let me just do a little bit of an overview of our game plan here. So where did this series come from, I guess is where I'll start with. I've been hearing so many people the last little while just sharing about, this kind of this underlying low-level chronic stress that they have about the state of the world. And it's been a really crazy last few years. I don't think I even need to explain what that means. And that story has looked very different for every one of us. We've all had our own different relationship with how crazy the last couple of years have been. And I know that a lot of people have a lot of worry about where things are going, whether it's the state of the economy, whether it's like geopolitics, the environment. Like we've been having some very weird weather where I live. If you've been out in a place like California, it's been intense. If you live in a place like Ohio with the chemical spill, there's a lot going on. And I know these are really heavy, intense topics that a lot of people are feeling. And what I really wanted to do with this is knowing that I have a real strong feeling the next 20 years are not going to look anything like the past 20 years. And that's pretty scary as well. But what I wanted to do is kind of pool our collective wisdom and experience and face these really uncertain times from a real positive and proactive approach. So we're going to be taking a positive spin on all of these things. And it's really about, what are practical solutions that we as individuals, as families, as small communities can actually do in this world where we don't necessarily know what's around the next corner. So that's going to be a big focus of kind of where we're going with this and what our intention is of this series. And my hope is that the series both helps alleviate some of the stresses that you're feeling and also makes you feel like, okay, I'm cutting through the overwhelm and I actually have ideas of things that will work for me. And, I'm not going to pretend that we have like the magical answer. I'm not presenting anything that we're doing as like the way forward. But what we are doing is bringing together an amazing team of presenters with that are all kind of innovating in their own unique niche in really adaptive, regenerative ways that I think could be part of this more resilient future and being really, just resilient in uncertain times. So we have the ability to showcase some amazing people, what they're doing, and you can kind of take whichever pieces fit the best for you. I'm hearing a couple make comments about sound there. It might be the computer on your end. I'm just going to pause for a second here. Please let me know if you can hear the sound okay. Sound works for me. Yeah, see, most people have sound here. So if you're having some issues with sound, unfortunately, it might be on your end, and you might need to play around with the settings a little bit. What I'm going to ask, we're going to do a quick pause here in the chat. I'm going to ask everybody to pause in the chat. And we have somebody, Charles Williams from Earth Activist Training. He's in the background tonight, kind of running logistics. So if you're having any issues right now, maybe we're just going to, just for a couple of minutes, we'll save the chat for anyone having issues. And you can connect with Charles and he can do his best to help you. There he is. Charles just said hi. So let's keep the chat quiet unless you're having an issue and Charles can direct you in there. And we'll do our best to figure it out. You can also always just try and log out and log back in. And sometimes that'll fix the problem as well. So anyways, to pick things back up again. So this is the first of 7 talks. This will be running live until April 11th. We have some amazing speakers coming up tonight. As I said, I have Dr. Naeem on and myself. I'll be the other presenter tonight. And tonight I'll be kind of sharing kind of a framework for what I call holistic emergency management from my background in modern day emergency management, as well as being kind of a modern day homesteader, someone that grows food and just has a passion for self-reliance and preparedness. And then Dr. Naeem's going to be coming on. He's going to be chatting about kind of the emotional and mental side of preparedness, even though he's a critical care doctor and could speak at length about that aspect of preparedness. He's actually going to be chatting about supporting our emotional and mental well-being. And we thought it was relevant to start the series with that, because if we don't have, if we're not feeling strong and grounded mentally and emotionally, the physical, tactical pieces don't seem to come together. So we're going to start there tonight. Beyond that, we have an awesome lineup. So I've got some pictures of some folks up here that are coming on. My good friend, Caleb Musgrave from Canadian Bushcraft. Next week, we have Shannon Lee Simmons, who's actually a financial advisor. She, goes on like CBC morning show, and she writes for the Globe and Mail. Very knowledgeable person talking about financial resiliency, but somebody that's, again, doing it from this holistic perspective, somebody that really believes in ethics, and, connection to nature, all those important things. So yeah, really fun series coming up the next little bit. So let me just go over a couple of logistics really quickly, and then we'll dive into the evening session formally. So first session of 7 happening tonight. They're happening every Tuesday at 8 p.m. We would love to have tons of people in here. So please tell your friends. If you know people, share it on social media. If you have newsletters, organizations you can put it out to, we would much appreciate you helping us spread the word and us growing this week over week, because it feels like a really important, relevant, and timely series. Second part I already mentioned. So Charles Williams is with us tonight. He's with an organization called Earth Activist Training. And you may know the name Starhawk author. She's kind of one of the other people with them, and she'll actually be our speaker with Charles in a couple of weeks. I think that's maybe the March 11th talk. But myself, I run Chris Outdoors as well as Wild Muskoka Botanicals, and Earth Activist Training with Charles and Starhawk. We're kind of the hosts. We're the people that put this experience together. And then we're pulling in people from all kinds of other amazing organizations. Charles will be in the chat tonight, though. So if you see links shared down in the chat coming from Charles Williams, then he might try and kind of capture, if myself or Dr. Noman messages anything tonight, he'll do his best to kind of capture those links, resources, throw them in the chat there. Again, if you have tech issues, you can connect with him down there. Other than that, you're welcome to use the chat throughout the night to connect with each other. I won't necessarily be monitoring it myself. I'll do my best to kind of look at it, but I find if I look at it too much, I get distracted. So just a heads up around that. And I did want to just set a couple of agreements around the chat before we dive in, and really just set our intention for what we're doing here tonight. And that's important to me. As I think about emergency preparedness and a resilient future, one of my biggest concerns is actually the social divide that I've seen kind of happen and be exasperated the last couple of years. That one actually kind of concerns me more than almost anything else. So I want to start off tonight's call by, inviting us to come together with respect for all people that are on here, regardless of where they're coming from. You're welcome to be here regardless of your gender, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your political views. Whether you associate with a right wing or a left wing or somewhere in the middle, a Democrat, Republican, whatever. You're welcome to be here as long as you can show respect for all people, and know that tonight's conversation isn't necessarily about politics. We're here to unify ourselves around this idea of what are practical steps we can take in our own lives and in our community to help make change. Now, as I say that, I also want to just acknowledge that, sure, politics are absolutely related to this conversation. And I'm not at all saying they're not important. I'm just saying that this focus of this series is really around practical solutions for individuals and communities in this work. And I also want to share that, if you're interested in these bigger topics of, how do politics come in, or maybe even like the community healing component of it, which is really, really important and something that I'm very interested in as well, there is absolutely a lot of work there. As a foundational principle, I believe that community and, having tight bonds with your neighbors is actually probably our best tool in resiliency in an uncertain future. So being able to heal the relationships between people is absolutely foundational. And when Starhawk and Charles come on in a couple of weeks, that'll actually be a component, or at least they'll touch on parts of that for their talk. So if that's a topic that interests you, I invite you to show up for that talk with Star and Charles, where they're going to be chatting about diversity and, how do you work together in community when you come from different lineages, you have different views, you maybe don't agree on everything. It's a huge, huge topic that we will explore a little bit. And the other part I want to acknowledge, and then we're going to kind of go into the formal presentation of the night, is just in thinking about that healing work, I do think it's worth just naming that there is definitely healing that needs to be done amongst cultures and amongst people. I happen to come from Ontario, Canada, and my ancestors are not from this land. They come from Hungary, they come from Scotland, they come from England. They all immigrated here within the last 100 years. And I want to just acknowledge, that there's been a lot of harm that's been done through the migrating of people across the globe and what's happened between cultures. Racism is very well alive in, I think, most countries in the world. And I do just want to acknowledge those issues as things that are very much related to resiliency, and hope that or at least maybe plant the seed that all of us think about, what is our own individual role in addressing things like reconciliation with the First Nations peoples of the lands, reconciliation amongst cultures, and what's my role in that healing work? So I just kind of wanted to name that. And it's something that I think a lot about. I integrate it personally, and I also integrate it in my business. So I thought I'd just kind of start us off and plant that seed, and then just ask for respect in the chat towards all people, and share that everyone's welcome as long as they can kind of stay by that place of respect and know that tonight's not about accusations. It's not about politics. It's about practical solutions and coming together as community. Okay, so let's dive into tonight's chat and where we want to go with it. So as I said, I'm going to probably talk for about 20 minutes right now, and then I'm going to invite on Dr. Naeem, and he's going to basically kind of take us home for the rest of the night. He'll be on for probably 45 minutes to an hour. So maybe the first thing I want to do is just thank you all for showing up. Thank you for having the courage to come and face some of these challenges head on. And it's sometimes feels easier in the moment to actually ignore these things and, and maybe not even ignore them. Sometimes it's realistic and practical. It's just like the day-to-day life that I'm already living takes up most of my capacity. I think that's very real for a lot of people these days. So I want to acknowledge you first for just showing up tonight and carving out a little bit of space to dive into this really, really important work. I feel it's so important for us to be thinking ahead a couple of years, a couple of generations right now in everything that we do, even though the demands of today are actually fairly challenging. And where I'm going to kind of go with my presentation tonight, maybe I'll just give you a really, really quick background, and then we'll dive into it. So for those that don't know me, Chris Gilmour is my name. That one picture there in the top left is my wife, Laura. And together we have a real passion for nature and nature connection, living close to the land, a passion for growing food, and a passion for self-reliance as well. We've always just had an interest of doing things ourselves, whether it's heating our home with wood or growing our own food, learning how to fix things. All those kinds of things have been a big part of our journey. And we spent the last 20 years together. We actually just celebrated our 20th anniversary, which is kind of exciting the other day. Not 20 years married, but 20 years in a relationship. But a lot of our last 20 years has been going around learning skills of self-reliance, whether it's permaculture, food, all those different things. A number of years ago, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole into professional emergency management. I was teaching wilderness survival and even teaching urban survival, teaching growing, farming, permaculture. And I started thinking about, with the world changing so fast, I'd really like to study disaster and emergency management from like a modern Western perspective, just to understand what systems and stuff exist there. And I actually ended up working in that field for quite a while, and I still do. Work in emergency management. So my passion right now has really become about combining and creating what I like to call a holistic approach to emergency management. So it's combining things like permaculture design and growing food, and it's combining that with knowledge and relationship to the natural world and understanding of ecology, and combining that with the best of kind of modern day emergency and disaster preparedness, and then also combining that with community and putting all of those things together. Because at least from my experience, I've often seen each one of those things kind of practice as its own thing. And to me, it's kind of like this complete skill set. So I've been having a lot of fun working with models and frameworks and developing processes to help people kind of combine those things together, people's, individuals, organizations. So I'm going to start by chatting about some of my top concerns actually about the world in general right now. And then I'm going to demonstrate kind of applying some emergency management frameworks to those top concerns, with the hopes that it actually just kind of gets the wheels thinking about, well, what would your version of that be? And in this very kind of overwhelming and when we look at this very overwhelming topic, it's easy to just be like, oh my goodness, there's too much. I'm lost in it. I don't know what to do. I'm going to share some frameworks from modern emergency management. And that's one thing I think modern emergency management does really, really well, is comes up with frameworks to actually disseminate through this mass amount of possibilities into actual action steps that we can take that help us with a whole bunch of them. So I'm going to share a couple of those frameworks with you. So I'm going to share a couple of these things that worry me, not to scare you, with the hopes that we're actually going to talk about them in a way that makes you feel more confident about them, more prepared for them. It actually helps decrease the overwhelm, not increase it. But it is worth just naming a couple things first. And I'm sure everybody is going to have their own version of this list, but here's my list right now of what's on my mind and what's worrisome for me. The first one is environmental disasters. So this is things caused by like extreme weather. We're seeing so much of that, particularly if you live like out in California, on the West Coast, what's been happening out there. And then the second one is human caused disasters. We just had that major toxic chemical release in Ohio, which does not seem to be getting the coverage on the news for how big of an event it actually was. So, that's a very big concern to me, those types of events. The next big concern to me is geopolitical changes. And I'm talking about this like on an international scale. So there's the social divide that's happening, but we're also seeing a huge shift in social demographics around the world. Literally like massive parts of the population aging is completely changing the way that the world's infrastructure works. Just the age demographics of the world is a fascinating thing to think about. Beyond there, we have a lot of infrastructure that holds up the systems of this world that's really old. And from my experience working in professional emergency management, working with municipalities, working with businesses, I can tell you from firsthand experience that a lot of governments, municipalities have not been able to keep their infrastructure up to date with how quickly, one, it's kind of declining, and two, how fast the needs are changing. So I have a real concern about literally the foundational infrastructure of the world, and what's going to happen to it over time. Health or medical stuff is a big concern of myself right now. So this is both the healthcare system, and the crisis and I don't know where everyone's coming in from tonight, but here in Canada, we're constantly being bombarded with the news of just like crazy wait times and, how stressed out our healthcare workers are. I actually ran a workshop a few weeks back with a healthcare team from a hospital in Toronto, and they're stressed to the max right now. It's been such a tough few years for them. The staff numbers are dropping, the workload's increasing. It's been intense. So I have some concerns about our healthcare system. I also have some concerns about emerging pathogens. We all just came through COVID, and COVID is one in a hay bale of possibilities, of things coming through. So that's on my mind. And then there's cyber threats. And this is one I think people often don't think about. But the ability of, another country or an organization to actually have a cyber threat on municipal or provincial or even federal infrastructure that could completely create a disaster in and of itself is a very real threat. Some of the emergency disaster conferences that I go to with like professionals from all levels of government, like this is a major conversation, the cyber threat risk and its impact on critical infrastructure. And there's also the ability for personal catastrophe because of a cyber threat, whether it's stolen identity, these types of things that we didn't have to think about so much in the last 20 years, I think are going to become a lot more real in the next 20. So I'm going to pause right there. Everyone take a deep breath. I know that was an overwhelming list, but this is where I want to kind of shift from the overwhelm into the practical solutions and hopefully like reduce the overwhelm. Is we actually have some amazing frameworks to work with when it comes to what do you do with that crazy list that just makes me want to not get out of bed in the morning. And I'm really thankful. One of my mentors in emergency management, a guy named Daryl Cully, Emergency Management and Training Inc. is his company. One of the things he really dawned on me is, emergency management needs to be simple. And there's actually ways that we can look at these very non-simple, complex things through a very simple lens that actually allows us to know what best action to take is in the moment. So I'm going to share a couple of frameworks from modern emergency management that I think are actually really helpful for every single person and community to kind of know about. And you can start to brainstorm a little bit about how to apply these to your life if they seem like they're valuable to you or relevant to you. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. This isn't really a deep dive on this topic. I really just want to get the gears kind of turning, although I am going to try and leave you with a few really concrete practical steps before we bring Dr. Naeem on. So the first one is this idea of the disaster preparedness cycle. And this is literally a concept from FEMA. And regardless of your political thoughts on FEMA, this is a very interesting framework that to me, even though they're applying it on the federal level, aspects of it can absolutely be applied on an individual, family, community, small business level. And it just makes a lot of sense. So if we start up at the top of the screen there, the first thing that we do is we just evaluate what our situation is. I kind of just did a little bit of a snapshot on that, one little piece of it anyways, or pie slice of it. Once we've evaluated our situation, we have to say, okay, well, we need a plan. What the heck are we going to actually do with this situation? We're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. Once we have the plan, we then need to go and organize the components of the plan. So this is organize the people, organize the gear. Then we might want to actually go and learn specific skills to actually carry the plan out. And then we may actually even want to take it a step further and run an exercise or a mock situation where we integrate the plan, we test the organization, we test the training, and then we basically go back to the drawing board and the cycle starts all over. So it's just an interesting framework to think about approaching this. Look at the disaster or the hazards and the risks, create a plan to the best you can. The plan is going to be what's the word I'm trying to say here? The plan is not going to be perfect. It's going to be flawed. You don't know what you don't know, and that's accepted when you make the plan. But you do your best, you organize, you train, you exercise, you reevaluate, and you just go through the cycle, and over time you improve. And what I find is this whole process works kind of like interest in a bank account that like compounds exponentially over time. So I'll just leave that cycle there for now, and we'll go on to the next piece here. The next framework I'd like to bring up is this idea of the 4 pillars of emergency management. And what this basically does is gives us an ability to now say, okay, there's all these possible disasters. How do I even approach getting my family, my business, my community, myself individually ready for all these potential things in making the plan itself? So the 4 pillars that we have here, the first one is prevent. Are there actions that we can take to prevent a bad thing from happening to begin with? The next one is prepare and mitigate. So how can I actually prepare myself, my equipment, my home, my family, whatever it is, to actually be ready or better prepared than I am now if something actually does happen or changes? And mitigate basically means, okay, if it's inevitable that something's going to happen, is there anything I can do ahead of time that's actually going to reduce the impact for it? So that's the prepare and mitigate. Then there's the respond. What do I have in place to actually be able to act in the moment? And then recover is, what do I have in place to actually be able to recover afterwards? And I'll share some actual concrete examples of these in a couple of minutes. But I just think it's an interesting framework. You could take any scenario here, let me just think one off the top of my head. You live in California, you live in British Columbia, and you're worried about, there being a wildfire. Can you prevent it? Well, maybe not preventing the lighting of the fire to begin with, but how you tend the greater landscape around your community, your farm, your homestead may actually prevent that fire actually burning down the place where you live or your community. So there are things we can do that may or may not prevent it. Can we prepare or mitigate? Absolutely. There's all kinds of stuff we can prepare for a fire. One example that comes to mind with me, a couple of the big fires we had out in Alberta this last year, I heard terrifying stories where the fire came in so fast, people had to evacuate. And some communities, there was 2 ways out of town. So families were separated at the time. Half the family went one way, half the family went the other way. All the communication systems are totally overwhelmed or not working because of the disaster. I heard so many terrifying stories of families that went days without knowing whether the other part of their family was still alive and made it out. And to me, that's like, talk about nerve-wracking and anxiety-inducing, not knowing whether your family made it out. That's terrifying. Well, there's actually a lot we can do to prepare and mitigate against that. And it's a basic family communications plan, or I say family, but use family however you want, whether that's your biological family or your close unit of friends that you associate as a family. Use family however you want there. But like, so many people don't have a communications plan in place. What would you do if your cell phone stops working, if the internet goes down and you're not with the people you care about the most? There's actually some really basic things that don't cost any money that you can literally do sitting down over a meal for a couple of hours that put you in a significant better spot if the power goes out or the internet goes out or you have to flee quickly to reconnect with those people. So a communications plan would be just one of many examples of how we might prepare and mitigate for a fire. Response could be anything from like, we have an emergency bag packed and we're ready to leave quickly, to we have an irrigation system that's built around the house that we do, all kinds of stuff. And then recover, that's a whole nother thing. But there's just a quick example of, like fires in California. I could apply that framework to absolutely any disaster you want to give to me. Now, I'm going to get to how to cut through the overwhelm in a second here, but the next part I wanted to mention is this idea of critical infrastructure. So we know this disaster planning cycle. We have this framework of the 4 pillars. How do we prevent, prepare, mitigate, respond, recover? Now, where do we start to focus that energy? A great starting point is this idea of what's the infrastructure that we rely on. So for example, in emergency management, Canada, like the country, has actually identified the critical infrastructure of the entire country. And you can go look this up online. It's our water systems, it's our safety, It's our safety and all the systems around safety. It's health, finance, transportation, energy, food, manufacturing, government, and information and communication technology. So Canada has identified that as its critical infrastructure. What I encourage people to do on an individual level is think, well, what is your critical infrastructure for yourself? And some of these categories probably apply. So when I think about that, I've kind of come up with like 10 critical infrastructures for my personal life. So for me, I think about like my shelter or my home as a piece of the critical infrastructure, the thing that protects me from the elements and makes me feel safe and comfortable. I think about water because I can't go more than a couple of days without water. And really, if I go more than, a day without water, it's going to significantly impact my brain and my ability to think and make decisions. Energy, so light, heat, the ability to cook is part of critical infrastructure. Food, communications, again, like being able to contact my wife, contact my parents, being able to know what's actually going on with the weather or hear an emergency alert. That's part of my critical communications. Health, hygiene, and medical, mental well-being. If my brain starts to crumble, then everything else starts to come down with it. So I need to actually think about, well, how do I keep this strong under stress? That's something I put a lot of thought into and actually do a lot of work to build in the good times with the hopes that if I actually tend that in the good times, it's available for me in the hard times. Finances are a part of my financial infrastructure, as much as I would like to not to be, and as much as I get frustrated by our modern financial system, it's a reality. I need money. I've got bills. Travel. So whether that's not going to Disneyland, that's like literally being able to go to my parents' house if something happens, who live an hour away from me. And then security and safety, So these are critical infrastructures. So you could actually think about, okay, what are the critical infrastructures in your life? Maybe if you wear eyeglasses and you don't see well without them, well, eyeglasses would be part of your critical infrastructure. So everybody's going to have their own unique things here based on their own needs. And what you can actually do now is go back and take this list here to prevent, prepare, respond, recover, and actually apply them to your critical infrastructure. Okay, is there anything that I could do around any one of these topics that helps me prevent something from happening? Like, can I prevent the water from the taps from stopping to run to begin with? If the taps stop running, am I prepared for actually not having water coming out of the taps? Do I have a plan for where I'm going to get my water for hygiene and for drinking? What am I actually going to do in that scenario is my response. And then how do I get it back up and going again afterward? What's my recovery process? So we can apply those pillars to any one of these aspects of our life. So the next topic I want to chat about here is this permaculture concept, which actually overlays amazingly with a concept in emergency management, and it's called stacking functions. So in permaculture, we talk about stacking functions. What's one thing that I can put in place, or thing that I can design into my homestead, my farm, my business that has multiple different functions or purposes simultaneously? In disaster management, we call this an all-hazard approach, and this is what allows us to start cutting through the overwhelm. Because when we think about that huge list of possible disasters, it's overwhelming. So if you want to take leaps forward in your preparedness really quickly, you don't want to dive into the nitty-gritty of every possible scenario right off the bat, because one, it's overwhelming, and two, you could spend a lot of time going down the rabbit hole, and that never plays out, and something else happens, and you're not prepared for it. So all hazards approach are really about, like, what are some foundational things that I can do that actually make me better off for a whole bunch of different situations at once? So I'm going to give you, I mentioned my hazard concerns at the top, when I started things off here. So I'm going to just go over them and then give you a couple examples of an all hazards approach to this. So I talked about disasters, both environmental, like natural, as well as human-made disasters. I talked about geopolitical, and one possibility of geopolitical is social unrest. Another possibility is even all-out war. Medical emergencies. I talked about the medical system and some of the challenges that we have with the medical infrastructure and it maybe not being available for me. A cyber attack on critical infrastructure of the country of Canada, something that takes down power grids or whatever it is. So what do all of those have in common? Well, all of them have a medical component to them, right? The need to actually keep people healthy, well, or respond to incidents that come up with people. So if I think about prevention, well, any preventative health measures we can take around supporting our own physical and mental health actually support us for any scenario that we're going to come across. So to actually make that a foundation of all of your emergency preparedness is just thinking, if I don't even have time for anything else, but if I can at least keep my body as healthy as I can, and I say that completely recognizing that's going to look so different from every person. Some people have ailments that are very real for them, and it's going to totally can change what they're going to do versus me. But it doesn't, I bet you there is some version with working within your body and within your life that is like, this is what I can do to maintain my ideal physical and mental health in this world, to at least give me a little bit more capacity to respond to anything. When I think about preparedness and mitigation in the health realm, I'm a huge fan of taking advanced wilderness first aid. Now, this is obviously something if you have a little bit of surplus of money to actually be able to enroll in a course or something. And I recognize that some people aren't going to be able to afford to do that. There is so much free stuff on the internet. If you don't have the money, it just means you're going to probably have to invest a little bit more time in sorting through all the stuff out there to find the stuff that's quality. But I think most of the stuff you do in an advanced first aid course is probably you can be found for free. It takes more time to sort through it. The learning curve is maybe going to be steeper and longer. If you can afford, though, to take an advanced wilderness first aid, even if you live in the city, even if you hate camping, even if you never go out into nature, the reason I say advanced wilderness first aid is so important is most of your standard first aid, your Red Cross, your St. John's ambulance, it's all taught based on the idea that advanced medical help is on the way. And you're basically keeping that person alive until the ambulance shows up. Wilderness first aid is based on being a day or more from a doctor, an ambulance, any kind of advanced medical. So in wilderness first aid, they actually teach you to diagnose and treat much more advanced situations. Everything from like setting bones to assessing, somebody's spine to see whether do they actually have a spinal injury. You would never in an urban situation say, oh, there's a mechanism for a spinal injury. They just fell off a diving board, they hit their head, and now their back hurts. You would never just say, oh, get up and walk away. You would say, no, like don't move until the ambulance comes. In a wilderness situation, there is no ambulance. So you actually have to be able to assess, well, do they actually have a spinal injury or not? Now, why I say this is in a disaster situation, whether it's a forest fire or an earthquake or a flood, medical help might not be available for days, maybe even weeks. And suddenly those wilderness protocols are super relevant even in the city. So a huge, huge fan. If you want the name Wilderness Advanced First Aid or Wilderness First Responders are the two kind of like standards across Canada and the United States. There's a greater organization called the Wilderness Medical Associates, and there's Wilderness Medical Associates of Canada and Wilderness Medical Associates of the US. And then all kinds of little sub-organizations that offer it underneath that greater certification body. Phenomenal thing to think about. Beyond that, there's thinking about like home healthcare. At the start of the pandemic, I was really scared. What if, my aging parents get COVID? When I was looking at the news, doing the reading, even going to official sites like Health Canada and the CDC, there was no advice on like how to actually, what to do with someone that's sick at home. Is basically, stay home and isolate until you need to go to the hospital. And that was really all I saw. I had a phenomenal chat with Dr. Naeem, who's a friend of mine, and said, no, man, like if you had somebody come into the hospital that was their lungs were all full up and they were dealing with this, like what are some of the things that you would do that don't involve advanced medical equipment or drugs? And he had a whole list of things. Oh yeah, well, we would do this and we would do this and we would do this. And I thought, wow, great. Why aren't we teaching everybody this right now? These are things that don't cause more harm. There's low risk of implementing them and they could actually make a difference. So if I'm not able to take somebody to the hospital, I at least have something I can do at home, right? So learning those kinds of skill sets, whether it's home healthcare, whether it's training in things like herbalism and working with herbs as medicine, I think are very, very relevant to our changing world and particularly our changing healthcare system. I'll give you one other example here, and then I'm actually going to transition in a moment here. So Noman, if you're listening, probably 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to bring you on. So just to get you ready to go there. So next thing, stacking functions, all hazards approach. So again, I chatted about environmental disaster or human-made disaster. And I also talked about like threats to infrastructure systems, whether it's, the power grid goes down because of a crazy storm, because of a cyber attack. Like it doesn't matter what the reason is. If we look at infrastructure failing, or if we look at major disasters causing infrastructure to failure, what's a common theme in all of those possible scenarios? Earthquake, flood, power outage, yada, yada, yada. Well, one of them is water as a critical infrastructure, right? So if I want to take an all hazards approach, and out of all the critical infrastructure, I'll argue water is absolutely one of the most important, because I can only go a couple of days without water, without drinking any. And on top of that, my mental capability starts to decline incredibly quickly if I go hours without drinking any water. And that's absolutely huge. So if I'm already under a stressful situation, I should be intentionally drinking way more water than normal, or at least a normal amount of water to help my brain actually support it in this stressful situation. And maybe that's something, if you haven't thought about it before, is like, if you find yourself in a really stressful situation, even if you have no idea what else to do, very least, take a sip of water. This is ginger beer, so maybe that's a bad example. Here's my water here. So very least, minimum thing you can do, all hazards approach, drink water under stress. It's not a magic cure, it's not a miracle, but it actually significantly impacts your mental ability to function. If the more you get dehydrated, it's changing the chemistry of your brain and your ability to make good decisions. So right there, drinking water in and of itself is an all hazards approach. But let's go back to it as critical infrastructure. So then if we go back to this framework of the prevent, mitigate, respond, recover, I'm going to chat about mitigation. On a municipal level or a regional level, an example of mitigation is actually ecological restoration. So many of the Earth's ecosystems are so degraded and threatened right now. And I think back to Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And, if Texas had more wetlands and more forest, which it actually had 50 years ago, yes, there would have still been a flood. I don't think it would have been as catastrophic as it actually was if there was more intact ecology or ecosystems in place. Intact ecology have the ability, and here's another example, the number of rivers in urban areas that are paved right up to the edge or have just tiny amounts of trees and plants. Then we have a flooding event and all of these toxins wash from the landscape into the water. Then they get into the groundwater and suddenly we're drinking this stuff. Terrible nightmare. Planting these ecosystems, restoring health to ecosystems, urban, rural, wilderness, wherever. One, it actually buffers the impact of extreme weather events to begin with. So whether it's buffering the amount of water that we're being flooded by, or it's potentially buffering forest fires, buffering all kinds of things, these plants also have the ability to clean things as they move across the landscape. There's certain categories of plants that are known to be dynamic accumulators. They'll literally pull heavy metals. They'll pull petrochemicals out of the landscape. So bringing natural ecosystems back actually cleans contaminations as they move across the landscape. If you're interested in this topic, I could do a whole night on this. And there's this whole concept called permaculture design. Earth Activist Training, who's here tonight and part of the series, they run a whole class on permaculture design. Verge Permaculture, who's also part of the series, they also run a whole series on permaculture design. And that's when you start to really learn about systems in nature and working with systems in nature in design of human systems to actually work with nature to buffer and to clean. Oh, and to even capture, where drought is a big thing that people are concerned about right now in parts of the world. We can work with restoring ecosystems to actually capture and hold more water if drought is the hazard that we're worried about. So I'll leave it there. That's a whole topic in itself, but check out both Earth Activist and Verge if you'd like to dive deeper into those topics. So there's a mitigation idea, but now let's chat, that's kind of bigger picture, like community design. Let's talk personal level. So how do we prepare and respond to any possible disaster where water is an issue? Well, one of them is just our knowledge of water contaminants. How many people here know what the major contaminants are that we have to worry about and what the basics are of filtering them or cleaning them? So we have sediment, which is literally just any kind of particle in the water. It may not be toxic, but it may make the water unable to drink. We have biological contaminants. So those are a big concern on the landscape, right? So this is your thing like your Giardia and your leptospirosis and your E. coli and all these different bacterial things. We also have viruses, which could have been on this, and spirochetes. And then we have chemicals. So those are kind of like our main categories of contaminants. If you literally sat down for a couple hours in an evening and just research those basic things and what you need to know about them, you've already taken a leap forward in your preparedness to any kind of water crisis. Now, beyond that, you want to think about, well, how do I actually treat these different things? So if I'm in an emergency and the water stops coming out of my tap, I want to know, how do I treat water? And I need to know what's in it to know if there's an option to treat it. And, unfortunately, if it's a crazy chemical and you don't know what the chemical is, there may not be any option to treat it. So if you can't treat it, the next thing is like, well, how would I collect water? Or have I already stored water? So these are kind of our mitigation tools when it comes to water. We can store water, we can collect water, we can clean and treat water. Those are all options. Another great thing that makes you so much more resilient is just to really understand your watershed that you're in. Where does the water come up out of the ground? Where are the springs? Where does it turn into creeks? Where do those creeks widen into rivers? Where do those widen into lakes? And what do they cross as they go across there? Where are they going to get contaminated along the ways? Southern Ontario, people will think this is crazy. Some of you from the States might not recognize this, but there's a river called the Credit River that comes out in Mississauga. And nobody would ever go and stick their hands in the Credit River in Mississauga and take a drink out of that water. It goes through agricultural fields, it's runoff, the water smells, it looks weird color sometimes. I've drinking water out of the Credit River without filtering it before. I'm still alive here today. Don't have cancer. I'm not saying do this at all, disclaimer here, but I literally went to where that water came right out of the ground doing a survival quest with a friend of mine one time. We literally found the spring where that water was coming out of the ground. It was freezing cold. There was no plants growing there. It was completely mineralized. It was almost like a crystal. And all of the contaminants were actually down water of that. Pretty quickly, that spring water becomes contaminated. But at the mouth of it, we literally took the water of the Credit River in our hands and drank it. And wow, what a gift that was to be able to do that in that moment. So to understand your watershed and how water moves across the landscape is just really valuable, building a relationship with water in your own resiliency. And then, of course, how would you clean water if you had to in an emergency? If your tap stopped running, what are you going to do? One option I just mentioned here is something called a Berkey filter. If you're not familiar with them, again, Berkeys are not cheap, so this is not going to be an option for everybody. Now, Charles Williams, he actually said he's going to try and get this up on the Earth Activist Training website by tomorrow, but he made a great video on making kind of your own version of a Berkey filter. I can't remember whether it's a mixture of sand or charcoal or a bit of both. And when you do your research on water contaminants, you can get into like, how does activated charcoal actually pull things out of the water? How does sand pull things out of the water? But I'm a huge fan of a Berkey. If I lived in an urban area, I would absolutely have a Berkey. For one, it pulls the chlorine out of the water. It pulls out lead. It pulls out even pharmaceuticals. There's more and more research coming out showing how all these pharmaceuticals are actually getting through our water treatment systems and into municipal water, even though it's gone through the treatment system. And I don't know that a Berkey is going to pull all of it out, but it definitely takes a percentage out of certain types of petrochemicals, certain types of heavy metal filters. And the other thing is they're gravity fed. So one, I would just put my tap water through it to begin with. But if the water ever stops going and you collect rainwater, you go to, you have a natural water body that you're not too worried about chemicals in, you can literally pour it through this gravity fed filter and have clean drinking water coming out of it. So a Berkey, in my mind, is one of the best pieces of info you can have or gear you can have as far as an all hazards approach to almost any disaster. Now, I am going to share a link here. A good friend of mine, Scott Miller, runs Conscious Water Canada, a really amazing organization. He's done a lot of work to support different Indigenous communities that are dealing with the kind of harmful legacy of the way our Canadian government has worked with them over the years and don't have good drinking water on the reserves because of things like mining. And there's the whole politics thing. I'm going to leave that off to the side. But there's a water crisis in Indigenous communities. He's done some amazing work doing his best to try and support with that. So if you want to buy a Berkey filter, I want to highlight Scott's company as a great place to order from, knowing that he's doing really great work in the world. So I'm actually going to just throw a link up right here. So if you live in Canada, particularly, you're interested in a Berkey filter, then you may want to check that out. He might ship for the States, I'm not sure, but there's definitely distributors in the US as well. So definitely something worth researching. Beyond that, learning the skill sets that Charles taught, around, well, how do you actually clean your own water? How do you collect water, store it? All very, very valuable. So I'm going to kind of simplify emergency management really quick. And this is kind of my closing part for the night. And then we're going to bring Dr. Naeem on. Emergency management, even though the actual disasters are complex, the frameworks are quite simple. We want to figure out what are the risks or the hazards. We want to identify what is the critical infrastructure that we rely on. And then we basically just want to apply our disaster planning cycle. Remember, make a plan, organize people and equipment, do some training relevant to it, do a little test exercise, go back to the drawing board. So our disaster cycle with those 4 pillars of the preparedness. And if you put those things together, it's actually a really amazing framework. If you apply the stacking functions or all hazards approach, then what you do is you look at those all hazard things and you do those first. Because doing the all hazard things when we don't know what's going to happen next actually allow us to take a leap forward faster for a whole bunch of scenarios. Once you've got a bunch of the all hazard things in place, then you can go down the rabbit holes of the individual things that you're worried about. I'm going to leave you with one last thing. Oh, someone just asked the do-it-yourself version. I believe Charles is going to post that on the Earth Activist Training website tomorrow. Charles, maybe you can just share a link of where you're going to post the DIY version of this video for folks on there. I want to leave you with one all hazards thing, and then we're going to bring on Dr. Naeem here. So I had mentioned the California fires, or actually it was an Alberta wildfire, and the thought of communication systems going down and not being able to know where your family is. One thing that costs absolutely no money and doesn't even take very much time, it's literally sitting down and having a dinner and sitting it, is to actually come up with a family communications plan. How are you going to communicate amongst each other if, phones, Wi-Fi things stop for whatever reason? And this could be, I'm not necessarily talking apocalyptic end of the world. This could be they're going down for a day. It could be they're going down for a week. It could be they're going down for months. Any one of those scenarios, a communication plan is incredibly relevant. So I'm going to switch my slideshow for a second here. Hold on. How do I stop? Oh. Sorry, I forget how to close my screen. Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. Okay, I'm going to bring on one other one, and then I'm going to bring Noman on after this. So I shared a document, and I'm going to put this up for a second, and folks can actually, I'll do that right now. You folks can actually download this checklist if you would like. So I'm going to share that right now. It should replace, oh yeah, there you go. The first part is just a little disclaimer thing. So the disclaimer is basically like, hey, this is not an everything approach. Please don't blame me if you're missing something from it. These are just some ideas to get you going that I think are incredibly valuable. So I'm not going to touch on all of these, but you can go and download a family communications planning template from almost any emergency medical association. FEMA has one. The Red Cross has one. Your local municipality likely has one on their website. So go and find an emergency family planning template from any one of those organizations and just fill it out one night at dinner. There's some brilliant stuff in there that a lot of people don't have. No money. This is an all hazards approach to so many different possibilities. Some basic things, inside of your home, agree on a place where you're going to leave notes for each other. Don't just assume that people are going to check here. Have a conversation. Okay, if an emergency happens at my house, I have to leave. I'm going to leave a note on my fridge for my wife. So she doesn't come home and panic. She doesn't know where I am. The phone doesn't work. She just goes to the fridge. Oh, Chris went over to so-and-so's house. Great. Stay here. He'll be back in an hour. Boom. Just chatting about that ahead of time can alleviate so much stress. Paper copies of the phone numbers. How many people don't know the name or the phone numbers of all the people in their family or their closest friends? They don't have them memorized anymore because we don't have to dial them. Have a paper copy of this, right? This is huge. Designate an out of province or an out of state emergency contact person. Sometimes what will happen in a disaster is there's so many people trying to use the communication system that the bandwidth actually gets jammed and you can't call locally. So my wife could be in the same municipality. The phone lines are still up, but I can't get through to her because the systems are jammed. But I might actually be able to call out of province. So if we actually pre-designate someone out of province or out of state, that's our go-to person, then I can call that person and say, hey, so-and-so, if Laura calls, tell her this is where I am and I'm heading here. I'm okay. I'm safe. Imagine how much stress that alleviates if you have a designated person far away from you that you can share communications with each other if you're able to get them out. Having a text group already set up with your family just so you can message multiple people at once to save time, that's a great one. I won't hit on all of these, but who will check on who in an event? I think that's a great one. So my parents live about 45 minutes away from here. Imagine there's a major ice storm, there's an earthquake, whatever the scenario, the roads are down, the powers are down. imagine my parents are like, oh my goodness, we got to go to Chris's house and check on him. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to go to my parents' house. And we don't actually see each other en route. We've both now put each other at risk because we're out in an unsafe environment, right? And we're going to see each other. Now we arrive at each other's house and we're not there. Imagine the panic. All we needed to do was say, hey, mom and dad, if something happens, please just stay where you are as long as it's safe. I'm going to come to you under this kind of situation. Boom. We've done massive mitigation. Just with that one conversation, it didn't cost us a cent to do it. So having those conversations with close friends. A hand crank radio is a great thing. Phones, everything's down. You can go to, the source or an electronic store and get a little radio where you can crank it to listen to the emergency broadcasts and have that in your emergency kit. So I'll leave it there. Those are just some kind of really high leverage things that you can do for communications that I think are really valuable. So I'm going to leave that one there right now. I've only got one other thing I want to share. This is a little bit of a plug for another event that's coming up on Thursday. So I mentioned my other passion in life is nature awareness, nature connection. And I actually think that is a major part of my resiliency as well. My relationship with the natural world and my knowledge of it, both for my awareness and my ability to read the weather, read the bird language, read the story, but also for my mental well-being and also just for personal enjoyment and quality of life. So I'm actually running another free call on Thursday of this week. Short notice for you. So if you can't make it, no worries, I get it. But we run these calls that we call the virtual campfires. And I'm going to just throw this up here. I'm running an open house for our virtual campfire this Thursday. So we're going to be chatting about spring birding. So learning to actually tell what birds they are from their call. We're going to be chatting about wildlife tracking, nature awareness. We run these calls monthly. We call them the virtual campfires. It's just a really awesome community. No politics, no fear, no problems. It's all just about building our relationship with nature. So if you would like to join us on Thursday, if you're around, or even if you can't make it, you can get the link afterwards, then click here. We'd love to have you on our virtual campfire this upcoming Thursday, or have you watch the replay. So there's a link to sign up for that. And I'm going to stop my share at this point. And Noman, Dr. Naeem, it would be great to have you come on and join us here. Are you ready?
Hello. Hear me cool? Hello. Hear me cool?
We can, yeah. You're coming through. How you doing,
Excellent.
man? Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, man. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Maybe just to introduce, we've known each other, geez, maybe even close to a decade now, eh?
Yeah.
You think?
At least, yeah.
Yeah, maybe even more than that. It's interesting enough. I used to teach a wilderness survival course, like a week-long course. And Noman actually showed up as a participant. I found out pretty quickly that he was actually a medical doctor, a critical care doctor, and we really hit it off. Similar interests around martial arts and preparedness. And we ended up becoming pretty close friends. We talk almost weekly now going forward. And he's a friend of mine. We get together and train together, but he's also been a mentor for me. I've learned quite a bit from him. And probably what really stood out for me, again, not wanting to get into the politics piece, but I've, as much as I'm super thankful for our modern medical system, I tore my quad last winter and I was so thankful for doctors and all the machines that they used. I've also had some huge frustrations with the medical system when it comes to kind of chronic health stuff. I'll just leave it there. And what I've really appreciated about Dr. Naeem here is that he really takes this whole approach, mind, body, spirit, emotion in his healing path, even though he's a, kind of Western critical care doctor. So I'm just really thankful for kind of the lens that he looks at this and some of the insights. He was really helpful. We actually did a free webinar with him during COVID around hey, what can people do at home if you're worried and you're scared? If someone gets sick and you don't want to go to the hospital or you can't. So amazing resource. So I won't talk any longer, but maybe just start off by just introducing yourself to the group. And if there's anything you want to share before we dive into this conversation, please.
Yeah, it's funny, Chris, you say that I've been a mentor to you.
Oh, sorry, no pause here. Noman, you've got a serious echo. Can you switch to the other mic?
Hold on.
Yeah, it's gotten actually way worse from when our test was.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. There'll probably be a little bit of a delay until this next mic kicks
in. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better. Does that sound better, folks?
Okay, good.
Yeah, much better. Okay,
it's interesting how you say that I've been a mentor to you, because I think that you've been a greater mentor to me when it comes to wilderness and primitive living skills and nature connection, but we can talk about that another time. So, I have a very interesting journey. I mean, I don't know, Chris, where do you want me to start? Because I can talk I can talk forever about this.
Yeah, you know what? I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I think we really want to dive
Sure.
into the conversation that we were trying to discuss. So maybe just a really quick
Sure.
overview of,
Cool.
what makes you interesting in life and your
So
background.
I am a pulmonary and critical care physician, and my interest in medicine really came from my interest in physiology, and my interest in physiology came from my interest in human potential. And I've always been fascinated by human behavior and human potential. It's because of some of the experiences I had when I was younger. And, I approach health and healing from a different lens because I've approached life from this lens as well, long before I became a physician. So I look at health and healing in a holistic fashion. As Chris mentioned, it's not just physical, it's mental, emotional, energetic, and consciousness. And I use the word consciousness instead of spiritual because sometimes spiritual can be polarizing, but everyone understands consciousness. So that's kind of who I am in a nutshell and how I approach life. Um, and my practice as a physician is only a role that I play. I do not define myself by my profession, as Chris knows. So that's that in a nutshell. And I can take it wherever you want to go, Chris.
Awesome. Yeah. The other thing I just wanted to mention, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole either, but I think it's just worth naming. There's a lot of talk right now about the healthcare kind of crisis that
Hmm.
we're
Hmm.
dealing with, and kind of some of the aspects of our medical system. As much as we're actually having some really amazing medical breakthroughs that are actually really optimistic and encouraging, and I do want to acknowledge there's some really awesome stuff happening in the medical world. There's also a lot of stuff that's kind of scary. The wait
Hmm.
systems, the stress, the declining infrastructure. And it's kind of all come to light coming out of the COVID. But I remember, Noman, you told me years before COVID that you were worried and saw this coming. So it wasn't like COVID suddenly created this.
Hmm.
This was actually already
No,
happening.
I mean,
So I just wanted to
yeah,
kind of,
yeah. Go ahead, go ahead.
please.
So,
No, I don't want to go down that deep
okay,
rabbit hole, but if you wanted to touch on
yeah,
anything that felt appropriate or
sure. I
relevant,
mean, I
please.
mean, the healthcare crisis that we're facing now in Canada and many parts of the world is 100 years in the making, and it all has to do with. And I don't want to get into too much detail here because I know Chris wants to take this in a different direction. It all has to do with kind of the hijacking of medical education by vested interests in the pharmaceutical industry and other interests, and kind of taking it away from a holistic approach, which it was. I mean, things like naturopathic medicine, herbal medicine, Chinese healing, indigenous healing, energy medicine, they were all part of medical education more than 100 years ago. They got taken out um, by J.D. Rockefeller, who was big in the oil industry and saw an opportunity for the farmers to partner with the pharmaceutical industry, and he basically lobbied Congress to deem all these other types of health and healing basically quackery. And he funded medical education throughout North America, and basically, the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to go too far
No.
down there, but I think we all know that there's some challenges there, and I appreciate you just kind of bringing that to
Mhm.
light. Where what I would like to go, is knowing that there's some concerns about the future of our
Mhm.
medical system. How do we empower ourselves to actually do something? I can't as an individual necessarily go out and fix the problems with the medical
Mhm.
system. What can I do as an individual? And I think that's maybe a good starting point into this approach of like the mind,
Right.
body, spirit,
Sure.
emotional kind of framework that you
So, I mean, when it comes to, staying healthy and healing, I mean, I think that your audience is very astute. I mean, we all know about our lifestyle really matters. So when I talk about lifestyle, I talk about nutrition, talk about movement and exercise, sleep, and stress management. But I'm not going to get into that because the thing is, you can find that all on the internet. You can look it up. Okay, that's not why we're here. But the big issue is this: how do we engage ourselves in those important aspects of health and healing? Well, it all has to do with the mind, right? And when you look at the human mind, it's basically divided into two parts. There's a subconscious mind and the conscious mind. most of our behavior is programmed at an early age, by the age of 7, in our subconscious mind. 95% of what we do is subconscious, and that's where habits lie. Habits are all subconscious. By definition, a habit is subconscious. And the thing is that it all has to do with habit creation and habit formation, to actually engage in the right nutrition, to make movement a part of your regular routine, to sleep 7 or 8 hours a day, to have those practices to help you deal with stress. It all comes with habit formation, right? And if you want me to go there, Chris, I can dive deeper into habits.
Yeah, I think it would be worth it to spend a little bit on, how do we actually create those good
Right.
habits, especially knowing that a lot of us have
Mhm.
like other stresses on us that like
Yeah.
sometimes just make it really hard to even
Yeah.
keep to a habit.
So
I can definitely relate to that. It's not an easy
it
world we
isn't.
live in.
So let's talk about kind of my world. So I spend a lot of my time with my patients. I'm a respirologist as well. I deal with patients with lung disease, helping people try to break bad habits. So for as respirologists, one of the worst habits is smoking. So let's use that as an example. If someone has been smoking for 30 or 40 years, it's become subconscious. They don't even think about it. They have a pack of cigarettes, they just pull it out, light it up, and they start smoking it. So the problem is that most healthcare professionals, they try to tell their patients, okay, you need to quit smoking, you need to do this, you need to do that. This is the problem. You're only talking to the conscious mind, because you're speaking to their willpower. And willpower is not the way to break bad habits, because this is all programmed in the subconscious mind. So I know that telling my patient, this is going to damage your lungs, you're going to get cancer, heart disease, whatever, you need to quit smoking. That's not going to work, right? So you have to realize that most of our behaviors are subconscious. So any habit you want to change is lodged in your subconscious mind, and you have to get to the subconscious. I'll give you another example. If you drive to work, the first time you went to your workplace, it was a conscious behavior. You have to pick your route. You have to figure out which streets you have to turn into, and where you have to avoid traffic. Eventually, if you're at that job for a year, it becomes subconscious, automatic. You don't even have to think about going to work. So that's the power of the subconscious mind, and we have to get to the subconscious mind. We have to realize that. Now, when it comes to, let's talk about breaking bad habits. When it comes to breaking bad habits, often the reason people engage in those habits is to mitigate stress. So things like smoking, drinking, eating a lot of sugary foods or desserts or fast foods, watching, mindless, television or videos on social media, whatever. It's to mitigate stress. So we have to realize what are our habit triggers, because every habit has triggers. So using the example of smoking, stress is one trigger I found in my patients that triggers them to smoke. Another is boredom, and another could be fear, which is related to stress. So you have to identify your stress triggers, right? And you do that by just paying attention to when you engage in the bad habit, smoking, for example. What is happening? I mean, did your boss just yell at you, or did you just get bad news, or did you just realize that you're in deeper debt than you thought you were, or you got some bad news about a family member? What was it that triggered it? So you have to know what your habit triggers are. Once you identify your habit triggers, what you need to do is you need to create a positive habit in order to replace that negative habit. And the way you do that is by creating an empowering behavior, identifying it, and practicing it time and time again. So I'll give you an example that I use with one patient. So a patient who loved to smoke, right? Because they're under stress, they're bored, whatever. I told her, okay, why don't you do this? Why don't you cut up a bunch of carrots, okay? Like, into long, thin strips, just like a cigarette. Keep them in a Ziploc bag and keep them with you. The next time that you want to light up a cigarette, instead, reach for a carrot and put it in your mouth and start chewing on it. And she thought I was crazy. And I said, no, just try it and see and see what happens. So just try it and see what happens. And the way I got her to do this is, first of all, don't wait for the stress to do this. Start getting into the practice of eating carrots throughout the day and keeping that bag of carrots with you. It doesn't have to be carrots. It could be anything. It could be cucumbers, celery, whatever. I just use carrots with her. So she got into the habit of doing that. So eventually, what happened is that she actually had the motivation to quit smoking. But we know that motivation and willpower are not the way. So in the first few times she tried this, she was unsuccessful. She would light up the cigarette. But I told her to keep at it. Eventually, a few of the times, she would actually reach for the carrot and not the cigarette when she was under stress and start chewing it and start eating that carrot. So what I'm basically getting at is identify some empowering behaviors that you can practice not only when the habit trigger presents itself, but you can practice on a regular basis. Now, it doesn't have to be that. It could be deep breathing. It could be going for a walk. It could be anything. And it could be any bad habit. It doesn't have to be smoking. So identify some empowering behaviors, practice them, and put them into practice to actually replace the negative habits.
Sweet. You know, it's interesting. I want to kind of see if we can't think about how does this apply to this greater conversation
Right.
series, you know, resilience in our changing world. Obviously, you know, quitting smoking might be a way that you think is creating more resilience for yourself as a human being. But this concept of habit forming, how do we relate
Chris,
this to this overall series?
Sorry, Chris, I just missed what you said. I just lost the audio for a minute. If you could just repeat the last part of that.
Oh yeah, sure. So I wanna kind of think about, you know, this overall series of like, okay, how do we deal with the emotional and mental stress of this world, and create habits to help ourselves actually mentally, emotionally be able to cope and actually face the world, you know, the resiliency. Do you have any thoughts around that? And maybe as you're thinking about that, I'll just share one piece. It's really neat that you mentioned about this, because the last few years, I feel like I've really slacked on my own personal training, my own personal health, my own personal preparedness. I think that's a common story amongst a lot of people going through the COVID. And I very much noticed that I kind of created a story for myself around being too busy. And just recently, I've been thinking about, you know, I'm actually, this whole thing about the world changing is like, it feels very real for me right now. And I'm like, I actually really want to make living my values, whether it's being healthier as an individual, whether it's actually being more self-reliant. So this is growing food, water. So I really decided I was going to recommit to our self-reliance and our homestead, to my personal health and fitness, as well as our preparedness measures stronger this year. And it's taken some serious work, but really what I've been trying to do is doing habits. And I, you know, I've got this routine now where I do affirmations every single morning, and I've been doing religiously for 2 months. And, you know, the first month I was constantly slipping, not doing things, but just resetting with the habit of the affirmation throughout the day. And suddenly, like 2 months jump forward, and I'm like, oh, wow, I'm like really in a zone now, working on our homestead, getting more prepared. And I don't have any more time than I had before. I still have all the same stresses, but I've created habits that work with it within my thing. I'm going to totally acknowledge that I don't have kids. So I'm not putting any judgments on parents. I'm not even going to pretend to know if I'd be pulling this off with kids. But I'm sure parents have all kinds of their own version of what it looks like for them, you know? And I guess that's what I want to highlight too, is, you know, what works for me is not going to work for somebody else, but there's something foundational about this habits piece as it relates to our emotional resiliency and maybe even physical resiliency for change. Anything you'd like to kind of speak to that idea and as it relates to the series?
I would like to speak to that. So the thing is that, you know, you talked about all these kind of challenges that we are facing, the climate change, the geopolitical, healthcare crisis, and all these things. So it's so easy to get caught up in all this turmoil that we see in the global world. But what I find is that what I think it is important to do is it is important for each of us to remain grounded right where we are. Okay. So now, how do we remain grounded? Well, there's several ways. Okay. So one of the things that I like to talk about is stillness practices. Now, what do I mean by stillness practices? A stillness practice is anything that helps you go deep within, because you can only ground by being deep within yourself. You're not grounded when you're like being pulled in directions by everything going on around you, and you know, you're listening to, you know, this chaos and that whatever is also happening on the world. You have to go deep within. So the various stillness practices that I recommend, I mean, it can be anything, but some of the common ones are things like meditation, It could be yoga. It could be Tai Chi. It could be martial arts. It could be going for a walk in nature. It could be going for a swim. It could be walking your dog. Any of those things, right? For me, the stillness practice that I most resonate with is meditation is one, and martial arts is another. I do a lot of solo drills. I mean, Chris used to do Kali, and I'm heavily into Kali as well as other martial arts. And when I practice them, whether they're at the dojo or at home, for me, it's a stillness practice. So we have to find a stillness practice to ground ourselves. Okay. Now, the other way to ground ourselves is journaling. And when I talk about journaling, I'm talking about several things. So I'm talking about journaling about your thoughts and emotions because we have 50,000 thoughts a day, probably more. And most of our thoughts are negative. And the thing is that, we are influenced by media, we're influenced by social media, we're influenced by marketing, advertising, by government, by our peers, by everyone around us. And it's so easy to get into that negative thinking. But what I find journaling does is the way I tell people to journal is at the end of the day, no matter what happened in the day, you had a great day, you had a challenging day, start writing about what you experienced. Write down all your thoughts, write down what you're feeling, what you experienced, and important, what did you learn from what you went through, whether it was good, positive, or negative? What did you learn? It is vitally important because that will help put it into context and help get all those thoughts and emotions out of your head and onto paper. Okay. And the other thing I talk about, and this ties in very well with habit creation, because you have to ask yourself, well, why do I want to give up the negative habit? Why do I want to empower myself? Why do I want to do these things? What I talk about is the powerful why. Now, what do I mean by a powerful why? It is your overwhelming reason for being here right now on the planet. It is your mission, your deeper meaning for being here. And what I will say is that everybody has a reason, they have a purpose, right? And it's up to each of us to discover what that is for us, right? And there's a series of questions that I ask people to journal about, speaking of journaling, to discover that powerful why. I mean, why they're here. And so those questions are a few things like, what were your childhood ambitions and dreams when you were younger? Number one. Number two, what are the skills, talents, and abilities that people compliment you on? Number three, who are the people who you admire and respect for what they're able to do? Number four is um, if what can you do that you don't recognize the time passing by, that time stands still? What is it that you can do? What is that you do? And the most important question of all is this: if failure was not an option and you could do anything that you could do, what would you choose to do now? I think it is important to answer these questions because as kids, we're filled with wonder, we're filled with excitement, we're filled with potential. And what happens is that we lose all that over time because of the education system, because of our peers, because of extended family, because of other influences. We get pigeonholed in post-secondary education, university, college, whatever, into a career path, and we often lose sight of what really matters to us. And this is where the values piece comes in. You have to know what your values are. What do you value? What is important to you? And there's various values determination processes you can do online. Dr. DeMartini has one on his website to identify what your values are. You can use your values to identify what your powerful why is and your reason for being here. And I think in this time of a lot of turmoil and chaos and uncertainty, it is important to have that deeper meaning, that higher mission, and an overarching purpose for why you're here.
It's interesting that you say that again too, because you know, during the COVID pandemic for a few years there, I was constantly kind of feeling guilty about not being on top of my health, not being on top of my preparedness, letting the homestead slip. And I was constantly trying and then falling off and not sticking through with stuff. And as I say that, you know, I've put this habit piece in that's been really helpful. But the piece that actually came before that was actually doing some serious work around like what actually matters, like what is your purpose, and something that one of my mentors that I think absolutely relates to emergency preparedness and navigating uncertain times. One of my mentors once said that, you know, purpose beyond self is one of the greatest strengths in the world. And maybe just purpose in general, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be beyond self, but he said purpose beyond self is one of the greatest powers in the world. And I think to have purpose is often what gives us the ability to take that next step when things get stressful. And, you know, who knows, you take that next step, things might actually get better, or you might actually make things a lot better for someone else. So that's really beautiful. We're kind of getting close to the end of the session. You had mentioned maybe sharing a breathing technique with the group for folks that aren't familiar, but, you know, another amazing tool. So something's just happened, you're totally overwhelmed. What's a tool that we can use to actually shift our state and our nervous system in the moment to help us cope?
So in the moment, stressful situation or threat or whatever, one of the breathing techniques that I love to use is called box breathing. So what do I mean by box breathing? What I mean by box breathing is that it's basically 5 seconds in 4 sections. So we can all do this now, those of you who are listening. So just let's do it. Okay. So what you're going to do, I'm going to describe it for you. You're going to breathe in for 5 seconds slowly. You're going to hold your breath for 5 seconds. Then you're going to exhale for 5 seconds. And then you're going to hold that exhale for 5 seconds. And then you're going to repeat. So I'm going to just do 2 cycles.
But by hold the exhale, do you mean like I exhale and then I actually hold my breath?
So you exhale and you hold your breath for 5 seconds on the exhale. So you've emptied your lungs and then you hold it and then you do it again. Okay. And box breathing is a powerful technique. Let me explain the way it works before we do it. What it does is that it actually activates your autonomic nervous system at the parasympathetic level. The autonomic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that controls all our internal organs and all our functions. The sympathetic part is involved in fight, flight, or freeze, the danger response. And the parasympathetic is the relaxation response. So box breathing, when you're under stress, it'll activate that parasympathetic part to help you relax and deal with the situation in a more controlled fashion, in a reasonable fashion. So let's do this right now. So just breathe out fully, and I'm gonna do the count for you. So I'm gonna start counting now. I'm gonna breathe in first. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we're going to hold that inhale for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to hold our breath for another 5 seconds. 2, 3, 4, 5. And then inhale for another 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another 5 seconds holding it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then exhale for another 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you can hold it for another 5 seconds. And then you get the idea. You can just repeat that. And if more than 5 seconds resonates with you, do 6 seconds, do 7 seconds. I just use 5 because it's easy for most people to do. 5 seconds in, hold, 5 seconds, 5 seconds out, hold. A great technique to activate the parasympathetic part of your autonomic nervous system to deal with a stressful situation.
That's neat. I've done something very similar. I mentioned my professional work in emergency management, and I've done some work in doing mock disasters in what we call an emergency operations center. So imagine like I'm working with a municipality and we're literally doing like a mock earthquake disaster in real time. We've got the police department there, we've got fire, we've got the town council, and we're playing this out. And it's like super stressful. We're playing through the scenario. And me being one of the people facilitating it, obviously, like I'm like taking a lot of the flack and heat from everybody else being stressed out, you know? And I've had total moments where I need to make a decision, or I need to go in and do a talk to the group to build up their esteem or give advice. And I'm completely overwhelmed. And just like stepping out the door, I'll just be, okay, be back in a minute, go outside, and I'll just do a couple rounds of something very similar to that. And then go back in. And it's amazing how fast it shifts my mental state and to walk back into the stressful situation and be able to at least perform the next step. So I feel like that's actually a priceless gift for folks when it comes to survival preparedness, just in that.
Yeah. Another thing I will say, Chris, is that also slowing your breathing down to like 6 breaths a minute is very powerful, because I found that we tend to breathe too fast and we breathe too shallow. And the way you can slow your breath down is to, just count your breaths, like the 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. That's 10 seconds, 6 breaths a minute. So.
Cool. We're almost done here. There's a couple things I wanted to kind of just wrap up with. One, I'd asked you to just share, do you have any like favorite like books, podcasts, people just around like emotional and mental resiliency? The one I actually queued up, I know about your webinar, so I'm going to share that right now. Because Noeem's actually doing a web class that's free called The Power of Uncertainty. So I'm going to put up the registration link for that right now if anybody's interested in actually doing a deep dive into this topic. But what are some of your other favorite resources when it comes to mental, emotional resiliency?
Yeah. So Chris, in terms of, podcasts and books and certain those things that I recommend, there's so much out there. And, one thing I can let me think about some podcasts. So one of the podcasts that I really like is, I don't know if you've heard of Aubrey Marcus. Yeah. Aubrey Marcus has an incredible podcast. He covers all sorts of topics, health, potential, mindset, and everything else in between. Aubrey Marcus is one. Another one is that I'm just, so Dr. DeMartini. Dr. DeMartini is a human potential, an expert. He was a chiropractor. He got into human potential. He's written many books. He has an incredible podcast where he talks about everything from mindset to health and healing to financial health, talks about spirituality and everything else in between. So, I mean, those are two of the podcasts I can recommend. In terms of books, there's actually so many books that I could recommend. In terms of when I think about mindset and emotional and spirituality, one of the books I think of is, I don't know if you've heard of this one, The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, I have.
It's a powerful book. It's a powerful book. I highly recommend that one. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey is a timeless book that's been around for decades. And it's a good book just to kind of get into the right practices to create positive change in your life and to take your life where you want it to go. So there's that one. And there's probably so many others I can talk about, but I mean, these are some of the key ones.
Do you want to, can you just email me a couple of those names after this and I'll send them out in the follow-up?
And I could probably email you a lot more besides what I mentioned. Sure.
Yeah, I don't want to overwhelm people with too many. I mean, part of what we're trying to do is cut through the overwhelm, but if you gave me like your top 2 or 3 favorite books and podcasts, then I'll share those in the follow-up.
I will email you those.
I'm going to mention one to folks that I know another big thing that often holds people back and even starting habit change or even looking for purpose is grief often by past trauma. And we're not going to go there tonight. It's way too big of a topic, but it's huge. We can talk about habit formation all we want, but sometimes, we have emotional blocks to that grief. A book that I came across that I thought was really valuable, it's called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Willard.
Nice.
I don't know if you've come across
that.
No,
I haven't actually.
It's a beautiful resource on grief that I found.
Okay. I'll have to look at that one.
I'm hearing a lot of people saying The Untethered Soul is incredible, so I'm going to have to check that one out. We have 5 minutes left here, Noeem. Let's chat about nature for a moment. Let's end things on a fun note here. because I think this is great. Noman came to this wilderness survival class, literally told me that he's coming to take a wilderness survival class to make him a better doctor. And I know, and I absolutely love that. And I know you've been going down this deep road of learning skills like wildlife tracking. And I thought maybe a fun way to end our night here would be talking about, a lot of people might think, well, wildlife tracking, why do I need to identify footprints? Can you share a little bit about your journey into wildlife tracking and learning to interpret the signs of nature, and how that's helped you with inner tracking and resiliency as a human being, and maybe even a better doctor?
It's incredible. So I learned tracking from one of your friends, Alexis Burnett of Earth Tracks. I took his tracking apprenticeship 10, 11 years ago. And I got interested, in wildlife tracking and primitive skills because I was always an adventurous person. I was always looking for adventure. So it was adventure that took me to primitive living skills and survival skills. But when I got there, I realized that there's so much more. Like, nature is such an incredible tapestry, and I see the natural world as a reflection of who we are. Right? The natural world reflects to us who we are. And tracking is not just about looking at signs of what's happened in that landscape, what animals have passed through there, what their activities have been, who they've preyed on, what are the signs they've left. But it's about a story, right? You get the story of the landscape from tracking, okay? And how I tie that into inner tracking is that we all have our own personal stories, right? And some of us may not have the most pleasant stories. Some of us may have some very tragic stories. But the thing I'd like to tell people is that we are not our stories, right? Our stories create the context to discover who we truly are. So we need to cut through the story and get to the essence and the source of who we are. So tracking out in the wilderness for me is a metaphor for tracking within myself, my thoughts and emotions, my feelings, and to see what's going deep inside of me. And often some people refer to that as shadow work, which sounds kind of spooky, but often we have deep layers of whatever grief, emotional pain, things we've been through that we need to cut through to get to the essence of who we are. Let me give you a metaphor from nature to describe our true essence. Our consciousness is like the sun, okay? The sun is always there. The sun is always there. It never goes away. Just because the earth turns in the cycles of the 24 hours doesn't mean the sun is not there. Our consciousness is always there. It is always present. Now, is the sun often obscured by clouds? Yes. Sometimes there's a storm, there's rain, whatever. You can't see the sun. Just like negative emotions. Negative emotions can become like clouds that come and obscure our true nature. And often we get identified with the negative thinking and the negative emotions. But inner tracking will help us cut through those emotions, release them, and get to the true essence of who we are. Just like when the clouds dissipate and the sun reveals itself. So, I mean, for me, that's the best metaphor I can use about nature and tracking and our inner world. So I hope that is meaningful for people.
That was absolutely beautiful. I think that's so relevant there, probably, through my journey as a naturalist, a tracker, someone studying ecology, the metaphors I find in nature have probably been my biggest coping mechanisms for the stresses of the world, and the biggest support in my reconciliation of just, the craziness of this modern life way, there's so much to that journey in nature. So to close us off here, just a reminder, if anyone's interested in the Power of Uncertainty class with Dr. Naeem, it's coming up there. We have another class coming up next week. So actually 6 weeks in a row, Shannon Simmons is on with us next week, and we're going to be actually diving into financial resiliency. And we're going to try and make this relevant to anyone, whether you have no savings, whether you have investments, regardless of your, like, I guess what you call your like social economic demographic. We're going to just talk about, you know, what can financial resiliency tools look like, and what could practical steps be? So that's where we're going next week. I did want to throw out one last just reminder about the virtual campfire. Noman just was sharing the beauty of tracking and nature awareness and metaphors. And that's very much the skill set that we work with in the nature's language and the virtual campfires. So if you want to join us on Thursday, that would be amazing. Any closing thoughts you want to leave? It's 9:30 on the dot, but do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the group before we break down? And thank you so much for joining us
Oh yeah,
today.
no,
We
thank
really
you,
appreciate
Chris,
it.
for this opportunity. I mean, you started off talking about, resilience and, looking to the future and an uncertain future. What I would like to leave everyone with this thought is that you are more powerful and resilient than you give yourself credit for. Okay, you are more powerful and resilient than you give yourself credit for. And if you don't think that or believe that, it's only because you have not dived deep enough into into the fullness of who you are and what you are capable of. Okay, so just explore that, take it where you may, and just discover the incredible power that we each as individuals have, not only to change our world, our own personal world, but to change and to touch the lives of others. Okay, so I just want to leave you with that thought.
I don't want to say anything else. That was beautiful. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Charles, in the background for the tech. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Please help us share the word. We're just getting going. We have 6 more classes coming up, each one on a different topic, a different aspect of resilience. So take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks.